No aspect of American economic or business life is so closely tied up with American mythology as the business and industry of agriculture. Agriculture holds a special place in the American imagination. Even today, the idea of the family farm. This is somehow sacrosanct in American thinking about the economy. And so while no one particularly worries if a mom and pop five and dime store goes out of business, the notion that the family farm might be disappearing is something that prompts popular musicians to hold benefit concerts, that gains the special attention of congressional committees and congressional delegations. The idea of farming as somehow essential to the American identity is an idea that dies really hard. There's good reason for this. The agricultural industry in America can really be thought of as the mother of all industries. The mother in a couple of senses. In the first place, everybody has to eat. Everybody has to eat every day. And so it is a necessity of the American economy that it produce enough, or at least it acquire enough, food for Americans to eat. If the economy can't do that, it can't do anything else. But there's another important aspect to it, and this develops a theme that I mentioned in the introductory lecture. Agriculture has always been both a way of providing the food, the fiber, the sustenance for the American people. It has also provided a springboard to other kinds of success through the appreciation of property values. In the last lecture, I talked about John Jacob Astor and how he got rich off the rise in real estate values in New York City. Well, in fact, this phenomenon of rising values in American land and American property is something that pervades the economy, and it has from the very beginning until now. When agriculture succeeds, it succeeds partly for its productive value, but also because the property values, the land values underlying the farms go up, and people get rich in that regard. Now, if we go back to the beginning of American agriculture, we'll want to investigate another part of sort of the mythology of American farming. There's the mythology of the family farm, which initially wasn't a myth at all. Most farms were family owned. But there's another myth that dates from that period that is probably more of a myth from beginning to end, and that is the myth of the self-sufficient farm. The idea that someone, typically a man, can take his wife and children and carve a farm out of the wilderness and there become independent and not in a position of having to pay attention to what much of the rest of the world is doing. The self-sufficient, the term that was often used, the yeoman farmer. The yeoman farmer is on his own, basically his own domain, and he is as independent as anyone can be. This notion of the self-sufficient farm, the yeoman farmer, is at the basis of American political thinking. In the introductory lecture, I talked about the tension between Thomas Jefferson and Adam Smith. Well, one of the fundamental principles, one of the basic tenets of Jeffersonian belief was that American republicanism, that's small r republicanism, and later it would develop into American democracy with a small d, is based on the independent yeoman farmer. There's a kind of political logic to this. Individuals can be politically independent in Jeffersonian thinking only if they are economically independent. Now, in Jefferson's day, 80% or so of the population was either living on farms or was closely dependent on farming. So these constituted the great majority of the American population. And in Jefferson's day, relatively few people worked for somebody else, worked for a salary or a wage. And so it was relatively easy for Jefferson to think that the future of America lay with these independent farmers who could vote independently because they depended on no one for their livelihood. In Jefferson's thinking, once somebody went to work for someone else, then that other person could dictate or at least strongly influence the way the individual voted, which, by the way, was easier in those days of public voting. People didn't go into a voting booth and pull the curtain. They announced their vote in public. So it was a relatively easy matter for an employer, for example, to coerce or otherwise influence the vote of an employee. So in Jefferson's thinking, the independent farmer was the one who was going to be the basis for American democracy. This yeoman myth had some basis, in fact, because there were all these people living on farms, and they typically did own their farms, so that part was good. But to the extent that the mythology had one believe that the farms were self-sufficient, this really does shade off into real mythology. Because from the very beginning, American farmers were never self-sufficient in the sense of providing everything they needed for their own sustenance. They never were independent of the rest of the economy. They were never, I guess to use a 21st century term, they were never off the grid. They were always part of the grid of the American economy. In fact, the first farmers, the ones in Virginia, as long as they were self-sufficient, all the Virginians nearly starved. And this isn't a figure of speech. In fact, the Jamestown colony in the beginning of the 17th century nearly starved. There was a period in early Virginia history called the starving time, when people were starving. The Virginia colony only survived once commercial agriculture developed in Virginia, in particular the cultivation of tobacco. So, American agriculture from the very beginning has been part of this larger net of business. And for this reason, it's fair to talk about American agriculture as an industry from the beginning, not simply a livelihood. It definitely was that. And not simply a place for people to live. It was that as well. But it was also part of the larger economy. It was really part of an industry. And as part of this agricultural industry, it's fair to think in terms of its place in the economy as a whole, and how the various inputs and outputs of the agricultural industry relate one to the other and to the larger economy. And here, a fundamental fact about American economic and business life comes to the fore. In every country, we'll do a little comparative economic history here. In every country, there is a certain ratio between population and natural resources. Or if you want to think of it in these terms, between land, these are the natural resources, and labor, that is population. Now, in the 18th, 17th, 18th, early 19th centuries, in Europe, the ratio between land and labor was relatively small. There was relatively little land per 100 people or per 1,000 people, however you want to measure it. There were relatively more people and relatively less land. Then, relative to what? Relative to the United States. In America, from the founding of the colonies, really until, almost the midpoint of the 20th century, the ratio in this country between land and labor always favored labor. Now, there's a fundamental law of supply and demand in economics that says basically that the scarcer some commodity is, the more it's worth, the greater amount of money it can command. As long as labor is scarce relative to land, then labor is worth a lot. So laborers in America could command much higher wages than laborers in Europe. This is an advantage for the workers, the laborers, but it also means that there is a very strong incentive in America for people who are employing labor to discover labor-saving devices. So we will see that the introduction of technology into agriculture is something that proceeds farther and faster in America than in any other part of the world. For example, at a time when Asian agriculture in China, was essentially proceeding on terms in which it had proceeded for hundreds of years. In America, agriculture was turning to technology. Why was this so? Is it because Americans were smarter than the Chinese? No, not at all. It was because there was a greater incentive for individuals in America to find labor-saving devices. Why? Because labor was so rare and therefore expensive in the United States. It's also, by the way, behind a fundamental theme of American economic and business history, and that is the encouragement to immigration. Nearly everybody who employs labor, from the farmer who's hiring labor in the 18th century, or for that matter, to the farmer who's hiring labor in the beginning of the 21st century, to the industrialist who has to find hands to operate his textile mill or his steel mill or an automobile factory in the 20th century. All these people who are looking for labor encourage immigration. They want more immigrants because more immigrants will bring down the price of this aspect of production, bring down the price of labor. So, agriculture is the fundamental American industry from the beginning. At the beginning, let's say, of the 19th century, the end of the 18th, beginning of the 19th century, probably 4/5 of the population is indirectly or directly engaged in agriculture. This changes over time. It changes for a couple of reasons. One is that technology allows the development of industry, and it makes new economic enterprises, new businesses attractive. But the flip side of that is that technology also frees up people who otherwise would have to be engaged in agriculture simply to feed the population of the United States. At the beginning of this lecture, I talked about how agriculture is the mother of all industries because the population has to be fed. Now, if it takes 80 people out of 100 to feed the population, that's what you're going to employ. If it only takes, well, in fact, we will see at the extreme end until today, it only takes 2 or 3 people out of 100 to feed the American population, then that's all that's going to be employed. And it has everything to do with the technological inputs. Now, the topic of this lecture is Cyrus McCormick. Cyrus McCormick was the inventor and the popularizer of the mechanical reaper, which wasn't the first piece of machinery to importantly change American agriculture, nor was it the last, but it was in many ways characteristic of the changes the technology brought to agriculture in the 19th century, and because Cyrus McCormick was a brilliant success at inventing and converting that invention to a business success. And here's something that I'll return to again and again. There is a big difference, there's quite often a big difference between inventing something and making money from something. Or to put it another way, between inventing something and actually putting that invention into practice. It's quite typically the case that inventors have a certain kind of intelligence and certain ambitions that don't always extend into the commercial realm. So there are inventors who never make a whole lot of money from their inventions. The ones who rise to the level of great business success are the ones who manage to figure out how they can convert their idea into business practice and then are able to carry on and defend the business against competitors. Cyrus McCormick took the idea for what he was doing from Eli Whitney, whom I mentioned in an earlier lecture. Eli Whitney was a Connecticut man who invented a device, the cotton gin, to facilitate the separation of cotton seeds from cotton fibers. Now, it was one of the ironies of history that Eli Whitney from New England, where the greatest opposition to slavery was centered, was the man who essentially made slavery an American institution. Whitney certainly didn't have this in mind when he invented the cotton gin. He was simply trying to make some money. And he was going to make some money by inventing this device that would allow cotton producers to get the seeds out of their cotton. Before you can weave the cotton fibers into thread, you have to get the seeds out. Until Whitney came along, plucking the seeds was a very tedious, labor-intensive business. You had to do it by hand. When Whitney invented the cotton gin, all of a sudden, a machine could separate the seeds from the cotton, and this made cotton production much more profitable. And the side effect of this was to increase the value of slaves, because nearly all the cotton in the United States was produced with slave labor. If one wants to get into historical counterexamples, if one wants to imagine the world that might have been, suppose no one had ever invented a cotton gin. Suppose the cotton culture hadn't become as profitable as it had. There were plenty of people who thought about 1790, The cotton gin was invented in the 1790s, popularized in the 1790s. Before that, just on the eve of this invention, there were a lot of people who thought that slavery was dying out in this country. And in fact, it was dying out in the North. It didn't die out in the South. Why did it die out in the North and not in the South? It has everything to do with the application of technology to the principal staple crop. It has everything to do with the differences between the cultivation of the major crops that were grown in the North and the major crops that were grown in the South. Now, by 1820 or 1830, nearly every northern state had abolished slavery. It's slower in some places, faster in others. And when the Northerners abolished slavery, many of the northern states and the inhabitants of the northern states patted themselves on the back and claimed or assumed that it was for moral reasons that they had abolished slavery, and therefore they could claim, and often did explicitly, they could claim the moral high ground in their debates with the slave South. Now, this annoyed Southern slaveholders no end, to be lectured in morality by the North, and the Southerners often pointed out something that the Northerners simply wished to avoid, and that is that the reason slavery died out in the North was not because Northerners were any more moral than Southerners, not because they were any higher minded, but that slavery didn't make business sense in the North. And this had to do with the differences between the practices in growing wheat and other grain crops, the principal crops in the North, and growing cotton and tobacco, the principal crops in the South. Wheat is a crop that requires an intense amount of labor twice a year for relatively short periods. In the planting season, when the ground has to be plowed and the crop planted, and it takes about 2 weeks of lots of labor, and then you don't need anybody working on the crop for the next 4 or 5 months until harvest time, when you do need lots of labor to bring in the harvest. And the harvest, the wheat comes ripe all of a sudden, and it has to be harvested within the space of about 2 weeks. If you start too early, it's not ready. If you wait too long, the grain crashes to the ground, or it rains, or something gets spoiled. So in the North, the demand for labor was intermittent. It was intense, but intermittent. And it made the most sense, from strictly the standpoint of business, to hire laborers when you needed them. Hire them during the planting season, hire them during the reaping, during the harvest season. But don't pay for their support the rest of the year. In the South, cotton and tobacco both require cultivation for many months out of the year. And so the workers would have to be kept on, well, essentially almost year-round, because if you take either cotton or tobacco, there's this long growing season. There's lots that has to be done during the season. Cotton has to be hoed, that is weeded, constantly. And with tobacco, even after you bring in the harvest, the leaves have to be hung in the barns, they have to be cured. And so there's demand for labor all year round. Now, the essence, leaving aside questions of morality, the essence of slave labor is that the workers are bound to stay in one place and they have to be supported year round. It made economic sense to do this where their demand for labor was available. The demand for labor was pressing all year round. In the North, where you only had to employ these laborers for a short period of time, slavery didn't make sense. No one wanted to pay to support workers 52 weeks out of the year when they only needed the workers for maybe 4 weeks out of the year. Oh, there's one other thing that I just have to mention here. It doesn't have a whole lot to do with business per se. Well, I guess it does, with the business of slavery. And that is, when the northern states abolished slavery, almost no slaves were actually freed. Because what happened was, when slavery became illegal, slaveholders, seeing the deadline coming, simply sold their slaves. And where did they sell them? They sold them to the South. So slavery ended in New York, slavery ended in New Jersey and Pennsylvania. But the slaves who had been slaves, by and large, weren't freed. They were just relocated to the South, which was another reason the South got so annoyed when the North would try to claim the moral high ground in this debate. Anyway, all this is background for explaining how technological development shaped the course of American agriculture. Now let's look at Cyrus McCormick. Cyrus McCormick was a Virginian. By the way, I mentioned the irony of the Northerner, Whitney, basically saving slavery. Whitney, here's a Southerner who will invent the device, the mechanical reaper, that, as we will see, allows the North to win the Civil War. Anyway, McCormick was a Virginian whose father was a blacksmith. He was a tinkerer himself from an early age, and he was always tinkering with this and that. He was always trying to figure out how to make some money. He didn't want to go into farming, although farming had been in the family. Farming seemed to him too staid. The horizons for success of a farmer were too small. So he was looking for some invention that was going to make him a whole bunch of money. At first, he decided that he was going to come up with this invention that would mimic the cotton gin in the following sense. The cotton gin facilitated the production of cotton fibers. Okay? Another principal fiber crop in the early 19th century, one that is really forgotten today for this purposes, was hemp. There were people throughout the Ohio Valley who were growing hemp for the purposes of making rope. But this rope that was used on American ships, rope that was used on farms, ropes that were used for all sorts of things. And this was a major crop. One of the problems about producing hemp and making it into rope was to separate the fibers of the hemp plant from the stuff that you couldn't use. And so Cyrus McCormick invented a hemp breaking machine. This was called hemp breaking. You break the fibers out of the rest of the plant. And he thought he was going to make his fortune in this hemp breaking machine. He got critical support from Henry Clay, who was a senator from Kentucky, who for years had presidential aspirations, and who believed that hemp was going to be to Kentucky what cotton was to the Deep South. And in fact, Clay, because he had these presidential ambitions, realized that there was this growing rift between North and South, and realized that if something could be done to diminish the hold of the cotton planters, then he would have, as this border candidate, would have a greater chance of getting ahead. So Clay promoted the production of hemp. Turned out, though, that the hemp breaking machine didn't work too well, and for various reasons, hemp never caught on as a major fiber item. And for decades, for more than a century, in fact, hemp basically disappeared as a crop in American production. Now, this is kind of an aside, but it's an interesting aside because it gets at an aspect of business history that I'm going to confess that I'm not even going to touch, and that is the black market side of American business. There are illegal business activities. We could talk about prohibition during the 1920s that are a major part of American business, but the records on them are really too hard to get at, and frankly, I can't cover everything, so I'm not going to talk about them. But hemp comes back into vogue in the late 20th century when the very same plant, the hemp plant, is grown not for its fiber, but for the marijuana that comes from the hemp plant. And by some estimates, in some parts of the country, marijuana is one of the 2 or 3 top major cash crops in this country. But because it's all on the black market, it's very hard to get the records on this sort of thing. Anyway, Cyrus McCormick, instead of becoming the Eli Whitney of hemp, just think of the possibilities, decides to become the Eli Whitney of wheat. The principal problem for wheat growers was, as I said earlier on, the fact that there's a great deal of demand for labor during a couple phases of the wheat growing cycle, especially during harvest, when once the stuff comes ripe, it has to be harvested right away. Because if it's still out there when a thunderstorm develops, and thunderstorms often occur in the late summer when the wheat is becoming ripe, it can be lost. And so you can either hire an army of individuals to go out and cut this by hand, but there are real limitations on that because even the strongest, even the most accomplished and experienced harvester can only cut anywhere from half to an acre of wheat in a day. And so if you are going to have a small farm, no problem. By the way, one of the reasons that the original family farm, I talked about the family farm earlier, the original family farm was thought of in terms of the quarter section, 160 acres, was that was roughly the size of land that an individual family could actually plant, cultivate, and harvest. You get much bigger than that, and you simply don't have the labor power within the family to do it. And that was well and good on the eastern coast, and to some degree even in the Ohio Valley. But once the American population moved out onto the Great Plains, it simply didn't make economic sense, where the horizons were very much grander, where the farms could be not 160 acres, not even a full section, 640 acres, but thousands, even tens of thousands of acres. If the problem of labor could be solved, the problem of labor, can you get enough hands to do the work? That's one way of solving the problem of labor. The other way of solving the problem of labor is to multiply the power of those hands by technology. So what Cyrus McCormick invented was a mechanical reaper. This is a device that cuts the wheat, that separates the wheat grain from the chaff, all in a single motion, and that greatly multiplies the power of the individuals who are operating the reapers, operating the machines. He first invented and patented his mechanical reaper in 1834. In those days, patents ran for 14 years. So McCormick had 14 years of a monopoly. Here I might just remind the listeners what the essence of patent law is. The philosophy of patents is that individuals who invent useful devices shall exclusively benefit from those inventions for a limited period of time. Now, the exclusivity is designed to encourage invention so that somebody who invents something doesn't have to worry about some lazy person sitting around and simply copying the invention 2 weeks after the invention comes on the market. There's a reason for the limitation as well, though, because the patent provides a monopoly. Nobody else can produce this same thing. And monopolies are a restriction on trade. From the very beginning of American business, there has been a tension between those people who are looking for monopolies, who want, by the way, what's a monopoly? It's a government guaranteed right to be the only one to produce or sell this item. Okay, I mentioned earlier about this tension between Thomas Jefferson and Adam Smith. Well, the capitalists, that is the business folks, the Smithians, want the monopoly. And I have to be careful here because Adam Smith himself was against monopolies. But the capitalist, the person who's trying to make money out of this, wants the monopoly because it allows the monopolist to charge whatever the market will bear. The Jeffersonian side, the one who believes in equality, who believes in openness, wants to allow people to have as much access to this as possible. But what happens is the inventor, the potential monopolist, has to bring government in to create and to establish this monopoly. So there's this tension from the very beginning. It's built into patent law. In those days, patents ran for 14 years. So McCormick had 14 years to make money off of this. It turned out that there were other individuals who had similar ideas and who were developing mechanical reapers independently invented on the same principles, but not close enough that they were infringing on McCormick's patent. Now, it just so happened that at the time McCormick developed his reaper, the settlement of the American interior was growing at a very rapid pace. And here's why. In 1825, as I mentioned earlier, as part of the transportation revolution in the American economy, in 1825, the Erie Canal opened up. And the Erie Canal allowed commercial agriculture to flourish throughout the Ohio Valley and into the eastern portion of the Mississippi Valley. In the 1830s and 1840s, railroads began to develop in the eastern half of the United States. Railroads extended the scope of commercial agriculture. Now remember, as I said early on, self-sufficient farming was always more a myth than it was a reality. If farmers had been content to be self-sufficient, they wouldn't have cared where the canals were. They wouldn't have cared where the steamboats were, where the railroads were. They would have gone out onto their farm and lived self-sufficient unto themselves. But that's not the way it worked in American history. Farmers only went as far as the transportation net would carry them because they knew they had these crops that they had to sell. If they couldn't get their crops to market, they couldn't make a living. And here there's an interesting parallel to draw between John Jacob Astor investing in land in New York City and farmers investing in land in first the Ohio Valley and then on the Great Plains. Astor knew that what was going to drive up the price of land in New York was the spread of the population of New York up to the land that he had purchased. What people on the Great Plains knew was going to drive the rise in land prices was the development of the transportation net. So the two are quite parallel. McCormick is able to sell his mechanical reaper to all of the farmers who were heading out into the Ohio Valley, all the farmers who were heading out onto the Great Plains. McCormick moves the center of his business to Chicago in 1848. Chicago was the great metropolis of the interior of the United States, and it benefited from both the canals of the eastern half, the Erie Canal, which opened up the Great Lakes, on which Chicago is located, and the railroads. Chicago became the place where the lake traffic met the rail traffic of the West. McCormick was able to establish a factory in Chicago. This factory produced reapers that were the favorite of farmers out on the Great Plains. McCormick hired agents to go out and sell to all the farmers on the Great Plains. He was one of the first people to offer sales on credit. You didn't have to come up with the money up front. You could put some money down and you would pay over time. This greatly expanded his market. McCormick benefited during the 1840s and 1850s by the general growth of population. He also benefited by the Civil War, which came along in the early 1860s. Here again, war, which by and large is bad news for the country, and especially a civil war, could be very good news for certain people engaged in certain aspects of business. Northern troops required food. An army travels on its stomach, as Napoleon knew, and McCormick and all those farmers who were using McCormick's reaper were the ones who, well, you could say in a very basic sense, won the Civil War. One way of looking at the Civil War, and this is a way that's a little bit unorthodox, is to consider the Civil War a conflict between wheat and cotton. In fact, from the Southern side, the Southerners often made this explicit. One of the reasons that the South was so confident in seceding was its belief that England and France, the major consumers of Southern cotton, could not allow the South to fail, because this was the supplier of Britain's cotton. Therefore, the British would have to come in on the side of the South. It didn't work that way. Why didn't it work that way? Because the British were even more dependent on northern wheat than they were on southern cotton. Again, getting back to the thing I said at the beginning, everybody has to eat. Agriculture is the mother of all industries, and you have to eat even before you have to spin cotton. And so the British did not side with the South during the American Civil War, and there were various reasons. One is they couldn't stomach the idea of supporting slavery, but equally because they were dependent on the North even more than they were dependent on the South. So the North won the Civil War. In fact, Southern agriculture, Southern cotton survived, but Northern agriculture, the wheat culture of the North, thrived even more. In fact, one of the things that we'll see in the history of American business is that the impetus in American business shifts from South to North as a result of the Civil War. One other aspect of Cyrus McCormick's success in selling the reaper, in mechanizing Northern agriculture, is that although this was something of a harbinger of the Industrial Revolution, it was probably even more important in making the Industrial Revolution possible. I said early on that in 1800, maybe 8 out of 10 people worked in American agriculture. By the beginning of the 20th century, that number would have gone way down. Why was that? Because inventions like McCormick's reaper allowed the work to be done with fewer and fewer people. So until today, American agriculture is the wonder of the world. It is far more efficient than agriculture anywhere else. Roughly 2 or 3 people out of 100 in this country in the beginning of the 21st century work in American agriculture, work on the farms. Why is that? Because they become so efficient that they can free up the rest of the population to do other stuff. In the next lecture, I'm going to be talking about Cornelius Vanderbilt and Jay Gould and the role of speculation in American business history.
After listening to Lecture 3, a student posed this question to Professor Brands. Was the invention of the reaper the beginning of the Industrial Revolution in America? Let's listen to the professor's response.
The invention of McCormick's reaper was one of the beginnings of the Industrial Revolution in America in 2 respects. One is that it applied mechanical power and the advantages of mechanical power to farming. So in that respect, a machine now is brought in to do something that previously had been done by hand, and that is one of the essences of the Industrial Revolution. But there's another aspect which is more indirect but no less important. Cyrus McCormick, by allowing a few individuals to do the work of hundreds, and in fact that's the mechanical advantage that his reaper gave to people, by allowing a few individuals to do the work of hundreds, freed up small armies of people to leave agriculture and go into industry. One of the things that made the American Industrial Revolution take off when it did was the availability of hands of people ready to go to work. And if not for the introduction of technology, of machinery into agriculture, a much larger portion of the American population would have been stuck, would have been required to stay in farming. Now they were freed up to go into industry. I have to caution here when I say freed up. In fact, the way they looked at it, they were thrown out of work. They didn't like this at all in many cases. But that's the way the economy evolves. Most people who have jobs want to keep their jobs. But as technology develops, quite often many of them become, in an economic sense or in a business sense, redundant. They don't like the fact that they're being laid off, that they have to move, they have to go find work somewhere else. But from the standpoint of the economy as a whole, that's the essence of progress. That's how things move ahead. It's often very difficult and painful for the people involved, but it is in the nature of capitalism that it works that way, which is one of the reasons that, as important as capitalism has been in the development of American history, it has had a lot of people who aren't its greatest fans. That was true in the 19th century. That remains true in the early 21st century. The fundamental principles, one of the basic tenets of Jeffersonian belief was that American republicanism, that's small r republicanism, and later it would develop into American democracy with a small d, is based on the independent yeoman farmer. There's a kind of political logic to this. Individuals can be politically independent in Jeffersonian thinking only if they are economically independent. Now, in Jefferson's day, 80% or so of the population was either living on farms or was closely dependent on farming. So these constituted the great majority of the American population. And in Jefferson's day, relatively few people worked for somebody else, worked for a salary or a wage. And so it was relatively easy for Jefferson to think that the future of America lay with these independent farmers who could vote independently because they depended on no one for their livelihood. In Jefferson's thinking, once somebody went to work for someone else, then that other person, agriculture, we'll want to investigate another part of sort of the mythology of American farming. There's the mythology of the family farm, which initially wasn't a myth at all. Most farms were family owned. But there's another myth that dates from that period that is probably more of a myth from beginning to end, and that is the myth of the self-sufficient farm. The idea that someone, typically a man, can take his wife and children and carve a farm out of the wilderness and there become independent and not in a position of having to pay attention to what much of the rest of the world is doing. The self-sufficient, the term that was often used, the yeoman farmer. The yeoman farmer is on his own, basically his own domain, and he is as independent as anyone can be. This notion of the self-sufficient farm, the yeoman farmer, is at the basis of American political thinking in the introductory lecture. I talked about the tension between Thomas Jefferson and Adam Smith. Well, one of could dictate or at least strongly influence the way the individual voted, which, by the way, was easier in those days of public voting. People didn't go into a voting booth and pull the curtain. They announced their vote in public. So it was a relatively easy matter for an employer, for example, to coerce or otherwise influence the vote of an employee. So in Jefferson's thinking, the independent farmer was the one who was going to be the basis for American democracy. This yeoman myth had some basis, in fact, because there were all these people living on farms, and they typically did own their farms, so that part was good. But to the extent that the mythology had one believe that the farms were self-sufficient, this really does shade off into real mythology. Because from the very beginning, American farmers were never self-sufficient in the sense of providing everything they needed for their own sustenance. They never were independent of the rest of the economy. They were never, I guess to use a 21st century term, they were never off the grid. They were always part of the grid of the American economy. In fact, the first farmers. No aspect of American economic or business life is so closely tied up with American mythology as the business and industry of agriculture. Agriculture holds a special place in the American imagination. Even today, the idea of the family farm. This is somehow sacrosanct in American thinking about the economy. And so while no one particularly worries if a mom and pop five and dime store goes out of business, the notion that the family farm might be disappearing is something that prompts popular musicians to hold benefit concerts, that gains the special attention of congressional committees and congressional delegations. The idea of farming as somehow essential to the American identity is an idea that dies really hard. There's good reason for this. The agricultural industry in America can really be thought of as the mother of all industries. The mother in a couple of senses. In the first place, everybody has to eat. Everybody has to eat every day. And so it is a necessity of the American economy that it produce enough, or at least it acquire enough, food for Americans to eat. If the economy can't do that, it can't do anything else. But there's another important aspect to it, and this develops a theme that I mentioned in the introductory lecture. Agriculture has always been both a way of providing the food, the fiber, the sustenance for the American people. It has also provided a springboard to other kinds of success through the appreciation of property values. In the last lecture, I talked about John Jacob Astor and how he got rich off the rise in real estate values in New York City. Well, in fact, this phenomenon of rising values in American land and American property is something that pervades the economy, and it has from the very beginning until now. When agriculture succeeds, it succeeds partly for its productive value, but also because the property values, the land values underlying the farms go up, and people get rich in that regard. Now, if we go back to the beginning of American